Previously, we explored the Great Famine and the bubonic plague. Compounded with this Hundred Years' War, and one would have a sense as to why Renaissance historians would call this medieval era the Dark Ages. Personally, I stay away from the term because it does not convey all the positive changes that occurred in Europe during this time period. So why is the war important? This war would mark the end of the feudal system and medieval warfare. The various principalities and duchies and small political entities would slowly be replaced by more powerful central leaders in Western Europe. Taxation from a central power would be increased, especially in France. This would be used to create standing armies and infrastructure. A sense of collective identity emerged. Since the war was fought exclusively on French soil, the French had to continually rebuild their towns and cities. They began to view outsiders as something more than just people not from their immediate area, but those foreigners who spoke a different language. For the English, a sense of national pride and even some form of patriotism began to emerge. Of course, this conflict also helped fuel the general distrust and dislike between England and France that would last until the 20th century. So the men and women, notice a picture of Joan of Arc, who fought in the Hundred Years' War, did not call it as such. To them, it was just a series of battles. The term was first used by historians in 1823. So, how did this conflict actually begin? Fighting started because the kings of England, descendants of William the Conqueror, who still spoke French, wanted to rule France as well as England and Wales. France was divided among many duchies and kingdoms. The English believed that it would be easy to divide and conquer. The form of warfare in medieval Europe was that which developed out of the military traditions and practices of the German tribes that overran the empire in the 4th and 6th centuries. Wealthy Germanic warriors began to do most of their fighting on horseback. Wearing a lot of armor and wielding a long sword and an even longer lance, the mass charge of these mounted Germans became more and more effective. As a result, the Romans suffered a number of serious defeats, even though the Romans also adopted the same mounted form of warfare. As impressive as the mounted man-at-arms, whether knighted or not, appeared, he was a warrior, not a soldier. Roman troops had been soldiers. Drilled, disciplined, thoroughly professional, the Roman army failed only when it got sloppy with recruiting, training, and politics. Medieval troops were not so much sloppy as highly variable and individualistic. Medieval knights, like their samurai counterparts in Japan, trained and fought as individuals. While thousands of these warriors would frequently join together as an army and make grand mass charges at the enemy, they always thought of themselves as fighting as individuals, not part of a military unit. This is probably why, as monarchs became stronger, they relied less and less on knights for fighting. And so what's important is that the Hundred Years' War is really the last major medieval war. And this war start had four main causes. The first cause was the English king controlled much of France, or actually parts of France, particularly on the fertile south. These lands had come under control of the English when Eleanor of Aquitaine, heiress of the region, had married Henry II of England in the mid-12th century. There was constant bickering along the French and English frontier, and the French kings always had a fear of an English invasion from the south. The second cause was actually closer to home to England. In 1328, Scotland was recognized as an independent kingdom under Robert Bruce. France then allied itself with the Scots. This Scottish-French alliance would last until the 1700s. Thus, the English faced the French from the south and the Scots from the north. A third cause was an economic cause. Flanders, today the northern half of Belgium, had grown to be the industrial center of northern Europe and had become extremely wealthy through its cloth manufacturing. It could not produce enough wool, though, to satisfy its market, so it imported its fine fleece from England. England depended on this trade for its foreign exchange. During the 1200s, the upper class English had adopted Norman fashions and actually began switching from drinking beer to wine. Note that beer and wine were very important elements in the medieval diet. Both contained vitamin and yeast complexes that the medieval diet, especially during the winter, did not provide. Besides, the preservation of food was a difficult matter in that era, and the alcohol in the beer and the wine represented a large number of calories stored in an inexpensive and effective fashion. People did get drunk during the Middle Ages, but most could not afford to do so. Beer and wine were valued as food sources and were priced accordingly. The problem, and how this gets back to the Hundred Years' War, was that England could not grow grapes to produce the wine it had to import. So a triangular trade arose in which English fleece was exchanged for Flemish cloth, which was then taken to southern France in exchange for wine, which was then shipped to England and Ireland primarily through the ports of Dublin, Bristol, and London. But the Counts of Flanders had been vassals of the King of France, and the French tried to regain control of the region in order to control its wealth. The English could not permit this, since it would mean that the French monarch would control their main source of foreign exchange. A civil war soon broke out in Flanders, with the English supporting the manufacturing middle class, which is understandable, and the French supporting the land-owning nobility. The final cause, which is really the catalyst to all of this, was the last son of Philip IV, known as the Fair, of France, died in 1328. This king was known as Charles the Fourth, and he was a direct male line of the Capetians. And this Capetian family finally ended the line after 350 years of rule. But Philip had a daughter. This would be the sister of Charles IV. This daughter, Isabel, had married King Edward II of England, and King Edward III was their son. He was therefore Philip's grandson and successor in a direct line through Philip's daughter. The French could not tolerate the idea that Edward might become King of France, and French lawyers brought up some Frankish laws, the so-called Salic law, which stated that property, including the throne, could not descend through a female. The French then gave the crown to Philip of Valois, a nephew of Philip IV. Nevertheless, Edward III had a valid claim to the throne of France if he wished to pursue it. And as I said before, this becomes a catalyst for war, because the feudal system was that of vassalage. A king, or in this instance a high king, would protect those in his kingdom in return for loyalty. In times of war, the king's vassals would rally around the king's banner. The French kings maintained that the English, since they had landholdings in France, were vassals of the French kings. The English kings, believing that they had now had a legitimate claim to the French throne, claimed that the French were vassals to the English kings. And of course, the only way to solve this problem is to go to war, apparently. So, what do these countries bring to the table? France had a large population, 20 million inhabitants, and they were wealthy. But they were weakened by the Estates General, which was a council of merchants and nobility. The Estates General only served to divide France's subjects. The French monarchs believed that the actual rule by the Estates was undignified, so the Estates never held much political power, and was a constant source of court intrigue against the French kings. The English were strongly united under the English king and great military leadership. They had a smaller population of 4 to 5 million people. England had a strong central government, many veterans of hard fighting on England's Welsh frontier. Edward II had actually become the first Prince of Wales in 1301. Today, the heir apparent of the English crown is given the title Prince of Wales. Wales is a part of the United Kingdom, as is Scotland, Northern Ireland, and England. The English also, the English also had veterans from defending the Scottish borders and from invading Ireland. The English had a thriving economy and a popular king under Edward III. Edward was prepared to fight France, and his subjects were more than ready to support their young king. Edward at this time was only 18 years old. And so the war begins pretty much in earnest, after, of course, Edward gets his armies into France, or at least the continent. So war breaks out in 1340. The French had assembled a great fleet to support an army which they intended to crush all resistance in the area of Flanders. When the ships had anchored in a dense pack at Sluis in modern Netherlands, the English attacked and destroyed it with fire ships, and victory in a battle fought across the anchored ships. It was almost like a land battle on a wooden battlefield. The English controlled the Channel and the North Sea. So from this point on, they were safe from French invasion. They could attack France at will, and they could expect that the war would be fought on French soil, and thus at French expense. Which is, if you're going to fight a war, I guess that's probably the best way to do it. Edward then invaded northern France in 1345. The Black Death had arrived, and his army was weakened by sickness. As the English force tried to make its way safely to the fortified Channel port, the French attempted to force him into battle. The English were finally pinned against the coast by a much superior French army at a place called Cressy. Edward's army was a combined force. He had archers, pikemen, light infantry, and cavalry. The French, by contrast, clung to their old-fashioned feudal cavalry. The English had archers using a longbow, a weapon with great penetrating power that could sometimes kill armored knights, even those later on in the Hundred Years' War that were wearing steel armor. Um, but these longbowmen sometimes could kill armored knights, and often the horses by which they rode. And this battle was a disaster for the French. The English took up position on a crest on a hill. This will be very much like the later Battle of Agincourt. And the French cavalry tried to ride up the slope to get to their opponents. The long climb up the soggy ground tired and slowed the French horses, giving the English archers and foot soldiers ample opportunity to wreak havoc in the French ranks. Those few French who reached the crest of the hill found themselves faced with rude but effective barriers, and as they tried to withdraw, they were attacked by the small but fresh English force of mounted knights. They were kind of doing cleanup work there. So now we have two victories for the English, and the English will follow that up with another victory. Nevertheless, facing much the same battlefield situation some 10 years later, the French employed the same tactics they had used at Crécy, with the same dismal result at the Battle of Poitiers. The French king, John II, and many nobles were captured, and many, many others were killed. Old-fashioned feudal warfare, in which knights fought for glory, was starting to come to an end. The nobility, forced to pay the nobility forced the peasants to pay even more taxes and repair the areas that were destroyed by the war. In 1358, this led to an uprising in France known as the Jacquerie. Although the French put it down, it was costly in fighting the war. And so this first phase of the war ended with a treaty in 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny. But France continued to suffer. The English had employed mercenaries who, once they were no longer paid, lived out the country by theft and plunder. Most French peasants would have found it difficult to distinguish between war and this sort of peace that they had. So what did the peace say? The treaty declared Edward's vassalage to the King of France ended. It affirmed Edward's sovereignty over English territories in France, and it contained the renunciation of Edward's claim to the French throne, which didn't last very long. But it was an attempted peace, which we'll see just, is just a pause in the warfare. But in England, in order to pay for the war, King Edward III had raised taxes. He needed to do this to pay for all his growing military costs. Although Edward III died in 1377, his grandson Richard II continued his high taxation policies. This led to a revolt of social classes, of peasants and artisans, against nobility and clergy. The riots actually began in Kent, when a man named Wat Tyler killed a tax collector by smashing his skull with a hammer because a tax collector had stripped Tyler's daughter to see if she was of taxable age. An upsurge of rebellion soon meant that Wat Tyler had about 100,000 men behind him. On the 10th of June, they swept into Essex, heading for Cressing Temple. Another individual, John Ball, was a priest who had been imprisoned for his sermons. Freed by these rebels, he urged people to kill the principal lords of the kingdom and the lawyers, and he was afterwards among those who rushed into the Tower of London to seize the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so you actually have a general uprising of the various factions in England. Angry at taxes being levied upon them, these people marched into London, they hanged the Archbishop, they beheaded a number of citizens. Tyler, Watt, was killed in battle, and with that the revolt pretty much disintegrated. Interestingly, Shakespeare made no mention of this in his play Richard II, and it really was ignored until the 20th century by historians. John Ball was eventually caught in Coventry. He was found guilty of high treason and was hung, drawn, and quartered on the 15th of July in 1381. Being hung, drawn, and quartered was the punishment for treason in England for centuries. As a matter of fact, I think it continued all the way up until the 18th or 19th century, on the books at least. Grisly way to go. And so what we're seeing here is monarchs of both kingdoms really faced internal dissent. In England, barons led by the Henry of Bolingbroke deposed Richard in 1399. They soon began fighting with each other as they faced rebellion in Wales and an invasion of Scotland. They fought each other, royal power diminished under Henry IV, as Parliament was swayed under the control of various barons. After his death, His son became Henry V and ruled from 1413 to 1422. In France, the French king had an entirely different issue in that he suffered from perhaps schizophrenia and was unable to rule. His cousin John, known as the Fearless, who had the title Duke of Burgundy, became regent for the king and his children. But Charles's brother, Louis, fought for favor, and both factions actually kidnapped Charles's children at various times. Finally, in 1407, Louis was brutally assassinated on orders from John. People of Paris supported John. John publicly could admit to the murders without any sort of recourse. This started a feud between the immediate royal family and the extended family, now the Dukes of Burgundy. This would last until Charles the Bold of Burgundy was assassinated by French forces in 1477. So you really do have attempts to take over the crowns of both of these countries from various powerful nobles within the countries themselves. Which leads us to another battle against the countries. Once England got control of their country, then they went back right and invaded into France to try to take France over again. And this is known as the famous Battle of Agincourt. This is the last great battle, the Hundred Years' War. It really was Henry V's army versus Charles's army, Charles VI. Charles, though, did not command troops himself because at this time he was suffering from some heavy bouts of mental illness. For instance, during one episode in 1393, Charles couldn't remember his name. He didn't know he was king. Apparently, he fled from terror from his own wife. He did not recognize his children, though he knew his brother and remembered the names of people who had died years before. In later episodes, into the 15th century, so getting closer to the Battle of Agincourt, it is said that he roamed the palaces howling like a wolf. He refused to bathe for months on end, and he suffered from delusions that he was made of glass. So I always think it must be difficult to lead warriors in battle if you're made of glass. So, the Battle of Agincourt, traditionally it was believed the English were terribly outnumbered, some 3,000 troops versus 12,000 French troops. But now historians believe that these numbers were from, quote, patriotic historians from England. So we know the English were outnumbered, but perhaps the numbers closer to 8,000 versus 12,000, which is still substantial. As I said before, this is the last major battle of the war. The French army was, of course, not an army. They were a group of knights who had come together at the request of Charles VI. They were undisciplined and, of course, ignoring the lessons of Cressy and Poitiers, were easily put into action doing the same things that they had done before, or at least what their fathers had done before. So the French mounted men-at-arms charged to destroy the English archers, only to be decimated and driven back into confusion. Sinking deep into the mud with every step, it had rained the previous day. They struggled to reach and engage the English men-at-arms. Wallowing in the mud, they then became easy targets for the English bowmen. Once the French reached the English line, it became worse. The French were packed too closely together to even lift their weapons to attack the enemy. However, as casualties mounted and prisoners were taken, the French began to engage the line in good effect. The thin line of defenders was pushed back, and it said that Henry himself was almost beaten to the ground. But at this moment the archers, using hatchets, swords, knives, and other weapons, penetrated the gaps among the now disordered French, who couldn't cope with their unarmored attackers, who were moving much more rapidly on the battlefield, and were either slaughtered or taken prisoner. The second line of French came on, only to be engulfed in the fighting. Its leaders, like those of the first line, were killed or captured. And the commanders of the third line sought and found their death in the battle while their men rode off to safety. And so, when we look at this battle, it's pretty one-sided. English losses are said to have been about 113, French losses over 5,000. The bulk of the French losses were actually knights. It's now believed that most of those knights didn't die in battle, but rather afterwards being taken prisoner. Henry V was worried that those knights might pose problems behind his lines, and so he instructed the English knights to kill them. The English knights refused, not out of any code of chivalry, but because they were going to hold those knights a ransom, because that's how the English knights would have been paid, and the French knights vice versa. You hold a knight ransom, his family's forced to pay the ransom, and then everyone's happy. So when Henry V gave the order to his knights. They refused. He then gave the same order to his archers, and they, more than happy, descended upon the ranks of the French troops and began to kill them in cold blood, it is said. And so what happened to the end of the war? Well, in 1419, the Burgundians, now openly in revolt against the French monarchs, the Valois family, joined with the English. The Duke of Burgundy had been assassinated, so his son became angry. Of course, this isn't Charles the Bold. He's not assassinated until 1477. This led to a series of victories and the Treaty of Troyes, in which Henry V took the crown. And so you've got Henry V now. He has a king. He's sitting on the throne of England and the throne of France. And of course, this is fairly short-lived. He dies in 1422, and his infant son, Henry VI, is proclaimed king of both countries. And actually, Henry V and Charles VI both died in 1422. So Charles's son, which luckily for us took the name Charles VII, he moved his court. He was known as the Dauphin of France. The Dauphin means the eldest son of the King of France, but he's not the King of France because he can't be crowned King of France yet, because the English control the areas around Reims. And this is where we have the emergence of Joan of Arc in 1429. I believe she's a patron saint still today of the French. So inspired by God, she came, led troops apparently, and was victorious at Orleans. So she broke the siege at Orleans. She provided inspiration, unified the French. The French were able to recapture the areas and therefore the crown. And then Joan led Charles VII across Burgundian territory to his coronation at Reims. So she is a true historical figure, and she does play a part in the later half of the Hundred Years' War. But in 1430, Joan is captured by the Burgundians. It was the English Inquisition that deemed her a heretic, not a French court, but an English court, which makes sense because she was an enemy of the English. So she was deemed a heretic in 1431. She was executed. She was burned at the stake. In 1435, the Burgundians, realizing that throwing their lot with the English isn't in their own best interest, realign themselves and unite with Charles VII. And so with that, of course, it really swings it back into the favor of the French. And so in 1453, the war ends, and England retains the area of Calais. And so what are the results of the war? Well, this war will mark the end of the English attempts to control continental territory and the beginning of its emphasis upon maritime supremacy, although we are a long ways away from the English having the most powerful navy in the world. As a matter of fact, we basically have to go to the 18th and 19th century to get to that point. By Henry V's marriage into the House of Valois, a hereditary strain of mental disorder was introduced to the English royal family. So in some ways, the French got him just a little bit. Of course, I think that's kind of a moot issue because all these families will continue to marry within their ranks decade after decade after decade, generation after generation. Also, there are great advances in military technology and science. The military value of the feudal knight was thoroughly discredited during this time period. The order, though, of the knighthood went down fighting in a wave of civil wars that racked the countries of Western Europe. But really, the knights just became a sideshow to the real fighting real battles. So European countries began to establish professional standing armies and to develop the modern state necessary to maintain such forces. In other words, they began to employ, for lack of a better phrase, mercenary armies and professional armies, where you're paying someone to fight. That becomes their livelihood. So from the point of view of the 14th and 15th centuries, was that the nobility and secular leaders were busy fighting each other at a time when the people of Western Europe desperately needed some strong leadership. And we will see that as we move into the Renaissance. Strong leadership coming out of Spain, coming out of France, and coming out of England. And we'll talk about that more in some later lectures.